Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Urban Fae Selkie Feud, Part 4 by Michael Lockhart. The Griffin did not let it slide. I started to warm up to him. You and this woman, her husband, and your wife, his nearest kin after he was orphaned, left him stranded in Mundania with savages. His guardian, the father of his lady, was deceived when his aunt, your other daughter, Tabitha, failed to take him in hand. Regardless of what outrages his parents may have committed, the boy is your closest kin, and you failed him. He ensured to look over at Sophronia to include her in the failure. Finally, he looked back to me. Mac Tirdirg, your kin have wronged you. I cannot judge your parental grandfather, as he is not part of my world or realm, and with your maternal grandmother is not currently a part of our clan. The great witch Sophronia now serves a witch queen of another realm, so I have limited say in her fate. However, I have an absolute claim on he you consider your maternal grandfather. He is not only of my realm, but of my high court. Speak what toll you would exact on him, and it shall be as you say. I thought as quickly as I could. I didn't like the tall penis of a man, but if I was too harsh, the king would think less of me. On the other hand, he seemed like the type to want justice done. My king, I would see him relieved of his current duties. His term is nearly complete in any case. I enjoyed the momentary surprise on Grampy's face, and I knew that. I also asked that he pay Weregild to the Hern for the loss of his wife and their home. He and his wife took me in, and in a large part inspired me to return to my original path in life. They suffered for their kindness to an orphan. Cresius glared golden dagger, streams, at me. I knew it was a fair judgment, and the king clearly agreed. He looked at Sophronia. You have until morning to gather any personal items of yours and any spies who still serve you. At sunrise you will leave and are no longer welcome in this realm on pain of death. Granny Seth looked shocked. She hadn't expected this. She knew that the Griffin clan would not expel her for her dark affiliations, only for acts that might bring harm or disgrace to the realm. There was definitely more to the royal decree than I understood, but what grandchild doesn't like to see naughty grandparents spanked? I wasn't off the hook yet. I see potential in you, Red Wolf. Perhaps you will serve your mother's people in some capacity. Certainly not with your current petty quest and the ridiculous little sets of raids that you consider a war. Still, those might train you to greater accomplishment, though they do not matter in themselves. Your true quest is to earn your place among the Fae. Kinship alone don't do that in Otherworld. We each have a role to play, yet within our class. We are meritocracies. So far, that appeals to you. Make it your life's quest to attain your greatest potentialities. Then you will be bound by your gaze to work to achieve that goal for the rest of your life. You have the blood of leaders. Both bloodlines of the Griffin clan are true. You have called me my king, so at some point in the future, I will expect you to serve me, at least for a time. Sophronia, who still sat on her comfortable chair, laughed. What do you say here? Especially to great beings as consequences, my red wolfling. Following some more of the endless courtesies, we were dismissed to find our pals and gather for supper. The fawn medics went shyly when I gave them the bronze rings, considering that they were goats from the waist down and known to be lustful and forward beings. Going shy was a sign of just how honored they felt. Malayon's chest swelled with pride, and he embraced each of the 2 members of his band. I was really glad that he didn't try that with me, what with his wang and dangles all naked. Then I played my ace. Friend Malian, as the leader who offered us such great courtesy and who wisely chose to hold back his forces rather than to plunge into battle, with no knowledge of whether our band was worthy, I award you a silver ring for your arm. I felt the need to specify where he should wear it. It's a small token of esteem to one who had steered us through the stormy seas of a great court. I also discovered that you did not leave to go chasing after our forces, and doing so took courage, if a bit rashness. The king's judgment is that you will have to accompany us and serve in my army. That got a cheer from the entire crew and helped us bond. During the next day, we prepared our forces for the return to Caer Mactir, the Wolf Hall or the Wolf Castle. Pick a language, they were all correct. I'd started to favor Wolf Castle. It sounded grim and cool all at once. My 3-legged wolf companion had agreed to the name Adhuel, which meant lucky in the predominant language of the Western Wolf Clan. I'd learned that a quality of Otherworld was that while there was an unfathomable myriad of languages, there had to be when Fae spoke with one another. We mutually understood, most of the time. It wasn't magical necessity, just the way or nature of Otherworld. Sorsha and I discussed at length whether Mundania mortals might be better off with a single language. Just pick one and see if they couldn't come to true understanding. But I would argue it just wasn't natural and normal for that world. Sorsha would say yes, and what language would we choose? It was something to discuss, to pass the time while we traveled. Otherwise, we'd be mooning over one another and causing nausea in our companies. Otherworld travel was weird. As with time, distance didn't mean the same thing as in Mundania. We had only one overnight stay at a different crossroads fort than the one with the clouded leopard guardian. The guardian in the latest hostel was a Naga. It had to arrange mirrors around its dais to protect guests from the death of its gaze. The accommodations were of the style of the Indus Valley culture, though no one on Mundania would have recognized the ethnic trappings of that mysterious long-vanished people. The Anthros were apparently descended from mortals of that ancient race, imported to Otherworld when their civilization was consumed. They would not speak of what caused the destruction, and many generations had come and gone since their arrival, so it was all rendered legendary. Mortals live longer and more robustly in Otherworld, but they remained mortals in the end. The quarters were very comfortable, and the next day we rushed home. We arrived to find a group of gnome folk awaiting us. There were 20 of the stalwart beings, led by our old friend Roar. We now had some shock troops. Roar took one look at Adhuel and called over several of his crew. They spoke to one another, and the wolf and he looked up at me. Red Wolf, we can assist your clan's being. There is some time before we march, and these gnomen are excellent crafters of silver. It would be a good fit for this worthy hunter-warrior. He is indeed lucky to have beings of such skill available so soon after his injury, though when their task is complete, he may wish to change his name to Silverfoot. Adhuel was pretty stoked at that and hobbled from the chariot with his chest out and head held high for the first time in days. Frida and Sherda politely waited until I had a moment to greet them properly and introduce them to Sorsha. Freda and Sorsha became instant friends. I induced Freda to the Fawn medics and set them to task to put together a medical corps for our army. While we were gathered, I called for everyone's attention. Even the Mac Moor, who stood at the edge of the crowd, paused, but remained hidden by his cloak. I have overlooked something I should have attended to earlier. When I was gravely wounded, it was Freda who saved my life and brought me back to health. For that, and the best stew I've ever eaten, I ask her to receive this golden ring. I knelt and placed the ring on her arm. She fairly glowed, and Scarda's chest swelled with pride to the point that the buttons on his waistcoat strained. The Mac Moor cheered along with the rest, then threw back his hood and beckoned me to his side. We had work to do. When Sorsha and I had crowded in next to him, he gave me a brief grin. That was well done, Rob. You will be known as Ring-Giver, and that is a great title and reputation to have. It keeps us poor, but folk will always want to serve those who are free with their wealth. Now to matters of immediate note. Shabil has returned just ahead of you, and between what the two of you have recruited, our forces may be sufficient. If our spies are correct, when we combine what we have with the mundane crew, we will have almost half as many as Serpente in raw numbers, and more than half of his numbers of Fae. It should take a grand skirmish or 3 to settle things, but our prospects have improved. I grinned back and wondered whether he knew the opinion of the Griffin about the scale and scope of our endeavor. Would he be disappointed, angry? Perhaps he'd laugh. I don't know, and saw no reason to bring up the subject, though I would have to tell him that I'd seen his wife. Yep, foobar. We had a meeting of the general staff that evening. So far, that included Sorsha and me, the big bad wolf, Shabil, Roar, and Kitsune Rede. There were other high-level officers whom we considered inviting, but we would be discussing intelligence matters, so the fewer the better for this moot. Shabil territory was physically very distant, yet it took only 2 quick portal hops to get to it, so in practical reality, he was a neighbor. Kitsune Riddle had not returned to her world realm, yet she and Shabil had both been back to Mundania while Sorsha and I had traveled. He started the briefing. We have our forces and will need to train them to work together in unison. That will take at least 2 weeks of O-time, as the Red Wolf calls it. By then, several months will have passed in M-time. Serpente has not only rebuilt his fortress to its former glory, but he has expanded and placed forts, operation centers, in several places around the city. He spends a fair amount of time in Fulshire Tower. He glanced at grandfather and then me. He still uses the pyramid as his primary base. They are conducting sacrifices twice per day. Sorsha asked, "What is he sacrificing?" I realized that we hadn't really discussed that. Shabil looked to me. He wasn't about to have to answer that one. For a change, I placed my hand over hers and hoped that it would produce the same salubrious effect on her that her touch delivered to me. Humans, especially young ones, they buy them from the coyotes and traffickers. You already know how he uses the young women and men as well. There's no kind word for it. Slaves. Sacrifices are different. Sunrise and sunfall? I asked Shabil. He nodded. In addition to pleasing his father, he probably hopes to lure more Quetzal dragons, and this is how they were fed. Sorsha maintained her poise, yet she could tell that she was seething. So that's how he enticed the young Quetzal dragon that tried to sunburn us to death. She nodded. Makes sense. Repugnant sense. But then we aren't fighting simply over a breach of protocol. Shabil grimaced and nodded. To compound his offenses, Serpentine's crew has been pushing a new street drug called Duar Medusae, or sweet sleep. It's powerful, and it seems to keep the users in a stunned state. While they daydream their personal fantasies, they tend to be pliant and biteable for general commands like, "Stay home and forget what you saw," or "Gather at a given place and tear up everything in sight for hours or days. Set fire at public buildings." He sells it cheap, with his slave labor to do all the work, but he makes plenty in volume to pay for his mundane forces and weapons. I don't know all the ingredients, but at least one is a flower with hallucinogenic properties from here in Otherworld. Kitsune Rettle joined in with her own information. In addition to his soldiers and his mortal crew, Serpentine has brought in troops and material from all over the southern border and recruited Frey from several dark-aligned clans and folk. It seems he is relying more on mortal aid than Otherworld. Perhaps he wishes to avoid provoking a greater conflict, or has limited permission from his patrons. The weapons of Mundania have grown powerful and more dangerous to our kind in the last 2 centuries of M-time. She looked to me and smiled. I grinned and nodded. She continued, "They are strong in their own world. Most of our forces are Fae. We have an interesting coalition." She looked at Sorsha and me. Few are all light or dark, one or the other in any world, yet we have tendencies. Sorsha and I nodded in unison, like we did so many things. I looked at the Mactirmor. He assumed his grim visage, the one he favored when he wasn't grinning wolfishly. We'll have to decide. Divide our forces and attack him all at once, or remain together and try the piecemeal approach, understanding that with each fortress we take, the next will be more entrenched. Maybe even conduct a guerrilla-type campaign? Hit and run. Wear him down. I like that, but it's just my wolfish nature. At what place do we begin? If we go simultaneously, how will we divide our forces for the greatest effect? I looked at him sternly. "Grandfather, I am pleased that you are helping with counsel, but are you in this fight? You committed to the quest to find and succor my Sorsha, which is as much as I could ever desire, but you have yet to declare your intentions. I mean to present no challenge. I wish only to understand." He nodded once. "Fair enough question. At first, I want you to begin gathering forces for yourself. Loyal forces that will be there for your sake. Folk on which to build your own household. Quests tend to do that by way of bestowing reputation. Then I had to take into account our collective folk. Shabil is a chieftain and may commit his household troops, but only volunteers from elsewhere. I have a larger holding and position within the Western Wolf Clan that should I act with the warriors and troops I command, I will invite a feud with a powerful realm. Not simply increased raids, but genuine bloodshed will ensue on a grand scale for millennia." He paused, a lord of drama as much of wolves. "I have decided to commit my own personal service and have quietly asked for a volunteer force. Now I have to decide whom to refuse. There were far too many volunteers with grievances against Serpentine and his ilk. The realm will be endangered while we were away this time, subject to raids. It's what I would do if I were in Serpentine's sandals. As for Full Sheer Tower, we should avoid that place and the mound. Other powers dwell in those, and we want to keep this at the level of a fight. A feud if we must, but involving clans, provinces, and at most realms. Powers are another matter entirely, and beyond our scope or kenning. Only they may choose genuine war, and none do so lightly. The meeting dragged on for what seemed a long time. It was hardly boring, but I was tired by the end, and so was Sorsha. There was so much that we didn't know. When we arrived at our quarters in the castle, we found Malion sprawled in all his nudish glory on a divan in the outer chamber with 2 of his fawns in attendance. I leaned toward Sorsha, but she beat me to it. I know, we'll have to have the furniture cleaned. That put smiles on our faces as we greeted our uninvited guests. The satyr stood, graceful as usual, and bowed. This was likely a bad sign. My lord and lady, we did not wish to disturb you, but we have some news. I stared at him for a moment to see if he would deliver it. He did not. Well, should we receive it in our chambers? Is it that private? Malion inclined his head. It is indeed private. Family business. I only wish to give you some preparation before you enter your quarters. You have a visitor from my world. With that, he gathered his companions and made to leave. Rest well, my lady, and, lord. There was no need for an eye roll, internal or otherwise. He was, after all, a satyr. What could one expect? Sorsha nudged me. I know we trust Malion as far as we can trust anyone, but should we be ready in case it's a trap? Even if he proves true, the visitor may not. We each drew weapons. I had the short sword and claw, as always, and Sorsha had a pair of long, slender daggers that belonged to her real mother. The leaders of the Red Seal clan ruled by way of the council and awarded her the weapons as part of her due inheritance. They'd given her a chest of items, much as I'd received the case from my parents. There were some interesting items in it, but we hadn't had time to look into most of them. We were as prepared as we could be when we entered the inner chamber. The interior was supplied by the Fae equivalent of electric lights. Biotech genius, little lightning bugs that nested in large clear jars. They required only dishes of water and sugared honey as food. Each jar included a shade that rested beside it. When placed over the jar, it would cast a beam of light upward and mute the remainder within the confines of the shade when it was time to sleep. The top stayed open so that the bugs could come and go at will. Freedom was much more cherished in Otherworld than in Mundania. And most of all among those who served. There were candles aplenty, but we snuffed those before we left. They were now lit, and the jars were all shaded. It was gloomy, and the flames cast wavering shadows over the walls and ceilings. The walls were mostly covered in decorative tapestries, so the colors of each scene danced with the golden and red flames of the candles and the hearth fire at the center of the room. Within one of the shadows, a form stood, still and black as Tartarus, as tall as Sorsha, and similar in build. I thought perhaps the visitor was for her, perhaps a relative. Yet the pale features that slowly emerged emptied my mind of any other thoughts. "Mom?" I whispered. The countenance was so familiar. The lips drew upwards at the corners and produced the smile I recalled so well. The being glided forward until she was close enough to reach up and touch my face, just the way she always had. Were she an enemy, my life would have been hers without much effort on her part. She broke the silence first. You have her eyes and hair, a hint of her nose. Her expression turned wistful. I'm so sorry, young one. It was a harsh destiny that left you marooned among the brutes of Mundania. My great queen had me focused on other tasks, and I didn't even get to see her off properly. We held our own memorial, but I would like to have been there at the one you attended, to take you home afterwards. Sorsha had remained silent. I could see she'd tensed when this being approached so close. Yet she could sense the power in her. This one could snap us like a twig, should we offer her a minor threat of our greatest skill. She parted her lips to speak to our guest, but the great lady turned to face her. "It is a delight to know that you are the light in the life of my grandson. You come from fine folk. Do not let any of his relatives put on airs with you. Most of them would not be worthy of your slightest consideration, much less your affection." Well, we could check that box. Sorsha would like her. I did too, but I had to be careful. I knew that if our enemies wanted to try a subterfuge, appearing so similarly to Mom would be the best way to instantly gain my trust. We couldn't take chances. At least I wouldn't take any. Not where my Sorsha was concerned. "Forgive me, lady." She smiled. Mom smiled. "Fiach miles," she supplied. I nodded and smiled in return. "Please understand, Lady Fiach. We are in a conflict and have faced many betrayals and illusory friends. I want to believe you, desperately to tell you the truth. Still, you are not the woman I saw at my parents' services with my grandfather. That one clearly loathes the sight of me, and I find it hard to believe that his wife, or former wife, would not harbor similar feelings." Her eyes glittered with some pent emotion that I could not read. "There is more to tell. It seems there always is. After all, I will leave and you can decide over time whether or not you believe me. What I will say will not affect your conflict, nor will I seek out your plans for what is to come. There are enough spies on both sides for that, and such duties are beneath my station." I offered her refreshment, and then we took seats. Once we'd settled, she began. "That being you met at the Griffin Court, Cresius." She anticipated my question, the same way the MacTirmore so often did. "Not that Cresius, the mortal one. That was his great-grandson by a mortal woman. Our Cresius loves dallying with mortal women, like Miss Ellie." She looked meaningfully at Sorsha. I saw my love's eyes light with understanding and a little revulsion. Lady Fiach, features now indecipherable, continued. "The result is, he had no true Fae heirs, and none of that ilk would tolerate him as a husband. Yet he was kin to the royal family and placed highly, so better beings than he searched for a way to resolve the problem. Eventually they settled on me as a suitable wife. Producing progeny from outside the royal family would preclude his descendants from inheriting anything significant for several generations. Yet he could appear as Honorable Lord Griffin, a high court, should he marry a high lady from a respectable clan." She sighed. Her stoic facade slipped aside for just a moment. "The problem was that while my family and clan leaders were in favor of the match, I was in love with another, whom I'd met at the Griffin High Court to meet Cresius, one who was above my station, yet he loved me in return, despite all obstacles that his position as a child of the king and queen created. I am high enough in my clan, but for such as he—" She paused to control her emotions rather than for drama. At least I hope. I really wanted to believe her, and I fought all the harder not to, so I would not be ensnared by an interesting tale by an alluring presence, a classic Fae deceit. Despite the rules of protocol, our passion resulted in your mother, Grain. I made a face. My mother's name was Grace, not Grania. She gave a short laugh. It's all the same, depending on the language. I named her Grain, so that is what I call her, and that is the way it is pronounced. So, there we were, a child on the way, unable to wed one another. It's not critical on his side for the common folk, but there are different rules for true Fae, especially among the ruling class. In our case, it wasn't about the position as much of the bloodlines. Griffins must wed and produce offspring with other griffins in order to maintain their ability to grow and transform. There was Cresius, in need of a wife, and me, in need of a cover for the safety of my daughter. He agreed to keep the secret in exchange for a pile of gold. And obsession with him, not worth as much in Otherworld, but I assure you, the way he drapes himself in the substance, he also likes the position the Union gave him. He was finally to be more respected. It never occurred to that one that deeds garner more genuine respect than appearances. When Grania met your father, the Maktir Orga, the Golden Wolf, you would think of his father-in-law, fraud though he was, would have been happy to attract more gold, even if it was metaphorical, but he was terribly angry that she had not married a griffin. Then she further estranged herself by following the traditions of my clan to serve time as a washer. The breach of law that she and your father committed would eventually have been forgotten. They were, after all, married in the first degree. They'd have to pay some penalties or have additional geisa put on them. But they would have survived had it not been for them drawing the hate and ire of Cresius and Sophronia. Her facade cracked again. It was an expression that bordered on wrath when she said the name of my paternal grandmother. I used the moment to interrupt. So if your true love was a child of the Griffin King and Queen, how did you... I mean, I know some things are different here, but I felt my features flush. She was my grandmother, after all, or so she claimed. This time she laughed in earnest, a very sweet laughter that put me in mind of pastures and trees in the falling light of a soft evening. Millis, her cognomen, meant sweet in the local dialect, and with connotations of honey. She continued, Griffins start life as anthros. They eventually transform, are removed from corporeal concerns. She winked. Not all of them transcend and transform to their higher state. Most do not because they mix their blood with other types of beings. She smiled with pride. Mine did. He had been forced to marry another, but a better option than I had been presented in Cresius. She transformed before he did, and he had begun to turn his eyes back to me when his own time came. He was magnificent, and I still loved him. He felt the same, but then our love was truly impossible. Her features grew deeply mournful. Newly transformed griffins, especially the males, are pugnacious. He ended up crosswise with a fire drake. Varmestorm, it was called. It was a contest few could have won without a great army, and perhaps not even then. Varmestorm was an elder fire drake, and had destroyed armies, well, at least very small ones. In my Griffin Prince had had more time to learn skills of his new form. In any case, I was devastated. With no more cause to keep up the charade, I divorced Gracious and fled home to serve as a washer. That's why I didn't know when Grania and Buck. She trailed off and held back any demonstrative grief beyond her body language and natural expression. That did more to convince me than anything she could have said. The last funeral I'd attended was mostly an emotional sham show. Had she broken into some version of attack deloides, I'd have run her through before she could wink, Urban Fae high lady or no. I finally understood some things about the family. Sophronia didn't necessarily hate me. She genuinely wanted me on her side, as she had wanted my father. She resented my mother for pulling him away from her. She also didn't like that my maternal grandmother was from a different Raven clan than hers. They weren't all that different, but apparently there was some long-ago schism, and she clung to it, though it was far before her time. Cresius truly hated me as the heir of the daughter who was held as his, but was not, and whose blood was in his view tainted by that of the Western Wolf clan. Plus, I'd killed Siobhan, his actual child. The Griffin Royals had been nice to me because I was their great-grandson. I looked to Sorsha, who was deep in thought. Sorsha, Cresius was so openly hostile because I'd killed his true daughter and your false sister. He has a real bone to pick. My grandmother, whom I decided to accept on approval, clapped a hand on each of us in one of hers and pulled them together. You at last start to see the webs. He has a true cause. True enough. He's not really a warrior, but he's very powerful. You could not defeat him. Yet. He is also skilled in other ways, and has many minions to act on his behalf. Creatures that will accept payment in various forms. He will be a danger to you for as long as he lives. I cannot help directly, though we are divorced. Certain of our vows are immutable. I cannot kill him unless he presents a direct threat to my life. Even then, I'd risk a curse. She gave our hands a gentle squeeze. Now I will go and wish you both well. I serve in a neutral court, so to take sides in this would be impractical. Yet when the master is done, I expect you to visit me and get to know your mother's folk. I absurdly thought for a moment, will you bake me raven cookies, Grandma? I would never have said something so discourteous to this lady. My lady grandmother, you have given us so much, with words and the knowledge they convey. Please know that in the greater scheme of things, this looming battle may not be much. Yet I go to war for my lady Sorsha, who was wronged and endangered, and for my foster mother, who was slain without cause, and other friends and innocents, who have suffered or died, rather than for my own grievances. She smiled as we all rose, together. I know that you have a serving heart, as well as a warrior's. The two go well together. If anything can save you, it will be that and your sweet young love. You should always cherish that you have with one another. Take care, though. Serpente is a very powerful being, beyond what you can handle, perhaps more than you will be able to handle. He even rattles the old wolf. Be thoughtful. Use what you have to reduce the threats he poses to the world you have both come to care for, and the power he believes his schemes will attach in this world as a result. She released our hands, which we now clasped together on our own volition and stepped back a little. She melted back towards the corner where we'd first ascertained her, and she did the swirl, her pale, smiling face so like Mom's, the last feature visible. So quoth this raven, "Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings."